Once upon a time, in a land long ago, a baby was born, a girl, born under empire, born as a minority under the empire, born as an ignored gender, and eventually orphaned. She goes to live with her uncle, who raises her graciously and kindly, but she remains a nobody with no real future. Until one day, in that empire, the king asked the queen to perform lewdly in front of some of his guests, and she refuses. You see, the king had decided that there would be 180 days of feasting and lots of drinking, and governance would just be neglected. Or maybe it would fall to petty lords to fight for the power, but the king didn't care. And so in that moment, all he wanted was the queen to do what he asked. And when she says no in a fit of petulance fitting him, he tosses her out and sends his minions to go throughout the kingdom and find another beautiful girl to be the queen. And of course they find our orphan. And she's taken to beauty camp for a good long time. And her hair is twisted and turned and pulled until her eyes water. And there's so much powder put on her face that her smile just sags under the paste. But all the regimes work, and she wins the contest. And she becomes the queen, and she escapes poverty, but into another form of capture. She can't leave. She's surrounded by a harem and by eunuchs, and she's there for the king's pleasure. But what choice do orphans and girls really have? Her uncle, he tries to visit, he shouts over the wall, they talk to each other, but they do it secretly because they hide her identity. See, she's part of the minority, but she can pass. And so she and her uncle decide it's better just to pretend, for the sake of getting along, that she's like everybody else. And that works until one day. One day there's a courtier, and the uncle offends him. And the courtier knows that the uncle is from that minority group. And in a fit of similar petulance to the king, because his petty self can't stand the minor insult, and because he distrusts all of those people who are different, he decides that not only the uncle, but all of his people will pay for it. And he concocts a plan to have them murdered. And he writes it up in an edict, and he takes it to the king. And he knows the king. He uses flattery, and he uses his own sense of outrage to stir up the outrage of the monarch, and it works. The king doesn't read the edict. He doesn't see how all of the children and women and men, their assets will be stolen, and they will be put in camps and sentenced to death. He doesn't read that. He simply drops his wax and sticks his signet ring on the edict, and out it goes. The banality of evil, right? And the courtier is delighted. He sends it out. It's posted in every town square like an invitation to a party, but of course it's an invitation to a murder. And the uncle sees it. And he goes to find his niece, the queen, and he says, "You know, this will come for you too. They just haven't figured it out yet. But who knows? Perhaps you're queen for such a moment as this." And it's a compelling moment that the queen takes seriously, and she and the women around her fast. And then she decides to approach the king. And never let it be said that women and orphan girls aren't clever. She knows how to play the king too. And she has a huge banquet. She invites the courtier to it. And it's wine and it's meat, but it's the final course that really matters. And she lays out her line with all of the flattery, using all of her beauty to describe what the courtier has done to her people. And the king, of course, sides with her. And so the people are saved. And the courtier, he's hanged on his own gallows. But the queen has saved everybody. And it's cause for celebration. And of course, she writes into that edict the ability for them to do a little looting of their own and kill a few people on the side because she understands what power is. And nothing is so black and white, simple. And so the celebration of Purim is born, and it's a celebration still celebrated today by our friends and neighbors and globally, people who are Jewish. And of course, the book of Esther is one of only 2 books in our scripture named for women. It's a good story. Most often we talk about it in Sunday school, but here it appears in the lectionary. And the center of the book is really in chapter 4, when the uncle, whose name is Mordecai, tells his niece, Esther, in the face of impending genocide, that perhaps it is that you have come to position for such a time as this. And he's insinuating that God has God's fingerprints all over Esther's rising from orphan nothingness to queen of the empire. But he never says it because God's name, it never appears in the book of Esther. But Mordecai knows that God works through people and history to accomplish God's purposes. And Esther participates in that willingly. And so most often what's drawn out of this book, and rightly so, is asking oneself, for what time have I come to the position that I hold? My life, what is it? How am I leveraging for such a time as this, the position I am in, the place in my life, for what God is asking me to do? Because truly, Scripture tells us God isn't like waving a wand, Dumbledore style, to change the world. God is operating through me and through you to bring justice and peace in God's kingdom. The question is whether we participate. And Esther does. But here's the other thing about the story. Esther is kind of decidedly unlike any of us. She's born a minority in a hugely impressive empire, and that's not who we are. I'm looking at mostly the majority here when it comes to our culture and our system. And Esther, of course, has so few choices, it's unbelievable. And most of us, by virtue of being born either in the 20th or the 21st century, have more choices than Esther. And most of us, that's because we've either lived or moved ourselves here to the United States. And so when a push comes to shove, we don't really have a whole lot in common with Esther. And it might be worth thinking about who around us does have a lot in common with Esther. Because see, the Esthers of the world and the minorities she represents are always making people a little bit uncomfortable. They certainly made people back then uncomfortable. Not everyone was real comfortable, but some people were sympathetic to them. But even if you were sympathetic, what did you do about it? Your exiled Jewish neighbor, what were you supposed to do? Give up some of your stuff so they could have more? Give up your security so they could have a little bit more well-being? And if they were a threat, should you treat them differently? How did you decide? But maybe those aren't just like questions for the empire back then. Maybe those are questions that percolate today through all of our questions and all of our minds and all of our media outlets. Because see, Esther populates the world. Esther is the Afghani woman clinging to a plane trying to save her husband. And, Esther is the woman who's trying to work 3 jobs to save her children from starvation. And Esther is the black woman trying to save her son from the police. See, Esther is everywhere. Esther is the orphan and the minority. Esther is the woman and the poor. And her voice is worthy to be heard because everyone is beloved of God. And as our friends in South America like to remind us, God has a preferential option for the poor. Esther's a story about the neglected and the poor being heard. And so the question, perhaps, is how are we hearing the Esthers of the world? When they finally come to a position such as this, that they get a voice, are we listening? When they finally are able to prepare a sort of table and use the tools of the majority, are we threatened by that, or do we hear what's being asked for? And maybe it's that we're in such a position as this, that we can leverage who we are for the sake of the Esthers of the world. And if it comes down to it, and the Esthers of the world need it, Are we willing to risk our own security and our own well-being for the well-being of others, to save not ourselves, but to care and save the ones who are different from us? Esther makes it as a good Sunday school story, see, because that's all a lot more difficult. And the book of Esther is bitingly sarcastic about power. To read it is to just read about mishandled governance and abuse of power, and yet Esther, the nobody, manages to come through all of the tangle of politics and make a difference and save the lives of people. She is a hero. She's not necessarily the good girl we make her out to be in Sunday school, but she is a hero. And she leverages what she has for the sake of others and doesn't consider her own skin in it. And so Esther's a story that still speaks. It's one worth rehearing. It's one worth retelling. It's one worth thinking about who we are in it at any given time. But not always putting ourselves in the shoes of Esther. Putting our shoes on of other people in the story and beginning to develop eyes to see where Esther is around us. And then to be able to understand how, along with the Esthers, we leverage whatever power we have for the sake of saving others who are equally beloved children, because to God, the well-being of all of us matters deeply. That's what the story of Esther is about. May we hear it with new ears and look for the Esthers around us and leverage ourselves on their behalf.